Welcome to Pure Passion. I'm Christine Sneeringer, your host for today's show, which will discuss the often misunderstood issue of transsexuality and other related concerns. Today, in our media-savvy culture, we're a lot more aware of people who want to pursue a sex change. For example, the critically acclaimed film Transamerica explores the life of a man wanting to become a woman through sex reassignment surgery. These are issues that the church knows little about and often has no answer for those who struggle. But the good news is that God has redemptive solutions. Today, we're going to hear from Cy Rogers, a pastor and global speaker on sexual redemption themes. As you know, Cy is no stranger to sexual struggles, as he himself overcame a history of sexual abuse, homosexuality, and transsexuality before God intervened and pulled him out of the ditch of immorality and set him on a path toward freedom in Christ. Today, Cy Rogers will share insights from his own journey, as well as give us an overview of issues related to gender identity. So now, let's watch and learn from Cy Rogers. I'm Christine Sneeringer, and today we're going to talk about transsexuality, a topic there's so much misinformation about. And I'm really excited that we have Cy Rogers, a global speaker and teacher on sexual redemption themes, to share with us what exactly is transsexuality. Welcome to the program, Cy.
Nice to be with you, Christine. Thanks.
Could you just start by telling us the difference between what is a transsexual and a transvestite?
Well, I think a lot of these terms are slung around in culture, and they're not always distinct to people, and they need to be clarified. We all probably know people who struggle in various ways with gender identity concerns, which these issues are about. And, you know, when we think, for example, of a drag queen, you know, we have a lot of film out there and a lot of entertainment, whether it's, you know, Some Like It Hot or more modern incarnations of the theme of men cross-dressing as women. We get blurred on these distinct categories. And so when I think of a drag queen, really, I think of someone in the homosexual subculture who is doing a parody of a female, celebrating the female, celebrating feminine beauty. And for some in that scene, this is a way that they obtain also a lot of affirmation. When cross-dressed, they get attention in a way that maybe in their everyday world they would not. But that's not to be confused with, for example, a transvestite. And a transvestite, while also a cross-dresser, generally speaking, is a heterosexual man. In fact, about 2/3 of them are married with children. They perform heterosexually, and they don't think of themselves as gay, and they are not. But they do have an identity development issue. They have never been affirmed, most likely in their history, as a male. And often in their histories, you'll find that they've been deprived of affirmation from father very specifically, maybe even abuse there, certainly detachment. And then there's also probably not been enough nurture from mother, or if there was nurture, there was over-bonding nurture to compensate for the father's lack of nurture. And so the cross-dressing transvestite man is actually almost cross-dressing to find a substitute contact for a missing mother figure, or from the nurture that childhood should have afforded. And very often when you attach that to developing sexuality, then of course it can really become kind of almost a ritualized masturbation episode. And it is often a ritualized behavior. And they often get discovered by the spouse, and obviously can cause marital conflict there, but really it shows that there's been deprivation and damage done in the identity development. And yet it's nice to know those things can be resolved when help is wanted. Then different, again, is the transsexual situation. And of course there is more information about that, and even some popular films like Transamerica coming out where this is more discussed. And this is where a person does not feel comfortable with their biological gender. They don't identify with it, they don't embrace it and belong to it. And sometimes, not only do they live cross-dressed lives, many times they want to pursue the sex change, which, you know, increasingly we hear a lot about. And so there are people who don't feel in harmony with their biological gender, and they wish to change it through the famous sex change surgery.
Well, I understand that that's part of your story, that at one time you were, in fact, pursuing transsexual surgery. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, you know, I kind of did it all in this sense. I felt very unaffirmed as a young man growing up. I had a broken relationship with my father, not really all his fault, of course. And my mother was killed when I was a child in a drunk driving accident. So my identity did not get really properly nourished. I missed my father and my mother. And consequently, this insecurity in my identity made me very vulnerable not only to homosexuality, and I did indulge in that lifestyle for a few years, but also I concluded that maybe if I'm not successful as a male, maybe I can achieve happiness, find love and success as a female. My failed masculinity, though I was on swim team and football team and track team and I tried to conform to the norm, I could never quite measure up. And that became very painful, frankly, to look in the mirror every day and feel contempt for myself, and that masculinity was something I had failed to achieve, and thus I only suffered contempt and rejection. So I decided if I'm a failure in this vein, then maybe I can achieve through a sex change happiness that masculinity has eluded me. And so I did attempt a sex change. I lived as a woman for 18 months in preparation for surgery. My 2 psychiatrists diagnosed me as a good candidate, and they referred me to one of the premier sex change clinics in North America. The prestigious Johns Hopkins Hospital sex change program in the 70s was probably one of the leading hospitals in America for that surgery, and I couldn't believe my good luck. But you know, it was then, as I lived as a woman for that period of time, that I had my encounter with God that changed everything. And you know, as I always say, He didn't wave a magic wand over me and fix it overnight, but what He did do was draw me to Himself, and He began to bring healing to that damaged sense of self that had made me feel so inadequate and incapable as a man. And while I grew up hearing, you know, sissy and you should have been a girl and all those words that did help to pursue me, or push me rather, down that path, God became a father to the unfathered part of me and began to speak nourishing words. And He dressed Himself up in skin and began to love me in God's family. And people walked through that journey with me as I began to become comfortable in my skin again. And so today, you know, to make the story very short, I enjoy being a man. I enjoy feeling good in my skin as a man. In spite of the residue of my history, it's nice that it doesn't cast a shadow over my ability to be a husband of almost 25 years and a father of an adult child. And it goes to show you that while that part of my life had been damaged, God knows how to bring healing. I'd been derailed. He can get you re-railed. And of course, I've been in ministry now for 27 years and been able to witness how even many transsexuals have experienced healing in their walk with God. And so, pastorally speaking, I know of 10 people around the world as I travel who have had sex changes, and then they've reversed their surgeries. Now, I never got that far. I'm thankful my intervention came first.
You never had the surgery?
Still, you know, it's nice to know, Christine, that even when people have had sex changes, it's not the final word. It's not the end of the story. I know 4 women who became men through surgery, and I know 6 men who became females through surgery, and at some point after their operations, they had an encounter with God. And that kind of goes to show you that just because you have a sex change doesn't mean you're beyond salvation.
Amen.
With that in mind, though, in each of these 10 cases, at some point after their salvation, the Lord brought so much emotional and identity healing to them that they were able to make peace with their original gender identity, embrace it again, not as an enemy or something that causes failure, but feeling good in their skin about their gender. And now they go on living as what they believe God intended. And so for the women who became men, I know a woman who lived for 10 years as a man. She got married, even lived as a husband. But now she lives as a woman again and is a missionary. I also know 6 men who became women, but now they all continue living as men. And while, you know, you can't go backward when you've had, you know, your genitals removed through surgery, even though the technology is more sophisticated in helping you return to your original gender, there's still handicaps and consequences of that surgery. But in these cases, these people feel that even though, for example, they can't produce physical children, they can live for the Lord and produce spiritual children. And they go on for the Lord. It's amazing to see how He can bring healing to the heart and how that's reflected through the body.
Amen. A lot of mixed feelings in the medical community about what is the proper treatment for transsexuality. So could you shed some light on that for us?
That's right. And you know, I'd never want to impugn the good motives of doctors who offer sex change surgeries. Doctors generally go into the business of doctoring because they are compassionate people who desire to help. And, you know, for many years it was popular in psychological and medical circles that if you are transsexual, then most likely a sex change would be the preferred treatment. At least it is often popularized as such in the transsexual community. You know, when I was pursuing the sex change, there was a requirement that I had to live as a woman for 2 years first. And that's because research has shown that there are many transsexuals, while absolutely adamant in pursuing the sex change. They believe that's the answer, that after living in that role for a period of time, there are those who decide, I don't want that surgery. Thank you for giving me that waiting period, so to speak, of getting used to it and seeing if this is what I really want. Because then later they realized, this is not the right way forward for me. And that was true in my own case. Thank God I did have that 2-year window of requirement to live as a woman first, because it afforded me time not only for God to work in my life, but for me to come to the realization the sex change is not my answer to solving my gender identity problem. And yet there are other transsexuals who feel convinced sex change is my answer. And I'm not here as a pastor to argue with those people, but even many in the medical profession realize that just because we can technologically create the sex change surgery outcome for these who want it, it doesn't mean that's always the best way forward. There is mixed feeling in the psychiatric and medical professions. And for example, I was assigned to Johns Hopkins, as mentioned, which was famous for that surgery. But even Dr. John Meyer made the statement in 1979 that research has caused us to conclude that the sex change is not necessarily going to offer an advantage for the transsexual. And consequently, they shut down their sex change clinic, canceled the waiting list of patients seeking surgery, and said that we will no longer treat through surgery what is basically an emotional problem. And so they're one of the premier organizations in the world for this surgery, decided just because we can do this, maybe this really isn't the best way forward. So there is a divide over the ethic issue. Whether we should be doing this for people or not. And in fact, in one country, there is a transsexual that's taken a particular hospital to court saying, you kind of pushed me through toward this surgery when really you should have made me wait longer. And, you know, we can't just make decisions based on the politically correct vogue of the day, or because there's activism encouraging us to embrace surgery as the best way forward. What the client may think is the best way forward may not be ultimately, in the big picture, the best way forward. And so these things have to be thought through carefully and not rush in. Just because we can do this doesn't always mean we should. At least that's the current feeling on the matter.
That's a very good word, that, you know, wait and see, and maybe God can intervene like he did in your behalf.
Well, and you know, I want to say in fairness, for many people who are transsexual, I remember what it felt like to cry out as a little kid to God to please make me a girl, because I felt like such a failure as a male. It's not that I was convinced I was supposed to be born a girl, but I did feel that I would never make it as a male, and I had only one option. And I know that many people who want sex changes, you know, they are in pain, they have lived a life that's been very difficult, they have often not been understood by their society or maybe their families, and that very often by the time you reach adulthood, people are either understanding and for your effort, or they're your enemy, because a lot of times transsexuals don't find a lot of support. And so I always like to say, you know, if you're watching and you struggle with your gender identity and you're considering a sex change, I'm not here to tell you what you ought to do in terms of whether you should have surgery or not. It's not my choice. But at the end of the day, whether you're a man or a woman, you need God in your life. You need a relationship with God made possible through Christ. He would rather have you messy than not have you at all. And if anybody has answers for your confusion, it's the God of clarity and of understanding. If you've suffered, he's the God of comfort. If others have not affirmed you, he's a father to the unfathered. So even though there are circumstances, whether they are biological, psychological, relational, or family-oriented, where life has taken you off track, it may not be your fault, but God wants to partner with you to help you get back on track for his best. So even if you've had that operation, or you know or love someone who has, that's not the final word. Because we even know people who've had surgery and now they're back on track with God. He can take you like you are and take you further than you thought you might go. So let that be an encouragement to you today. You want to come to my church? I'll tell you what. We'll encourage you to grow in God, and then he'll help you sort it out. If that takes time, so what? God's got a lot of time when you think of the eternal point of view, but let him begin that journey with you now, even today if you're watching. And you struggle with things like this, you want to be in touch with our website that you can find out more good resources and hear the stories of others who've come through like you can too.
You also just touch on hermaphrodites and intersex community as we're talking about all these different variations. I'd just like you to briefly touch on that too.
Well, and it's true. You know, we have a genetic code. XY for male, XX for female, but it's a fallen world, and that's true for our biology. And so we also find that there are people who are born with, genetic flaws. G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis kind of have a similar quote that goes decades back. It's something like this as I paraphrase it. Just because Mother Nature gave it to you doesn't make it normal or natural, because Mother Nature is not your mother. She's your fallen sister. And what that means is that we have birth defects and predispositions sewn into us because of fallen biology. And intersex people, it's not their fault that they have genetic flaws. And so, for example, there are people who suffer from Klinefelters. This is where the male has an extra female chromosome. Now, it doesn't make him homosexual. It doesn't make him effeminate. It doesn't make him transsexual, but it does mean that he will be sterile. And how people with that condition are nurtured can either produce a healthier identity or damage it further. At the same time, there are females who may be born with what's called Turner syndrome. And this is where the female has a missing chromosome. Instead of being XX, she's X blank. Now, it doesn't make her butch and mannish. It doesn't make her lesbian, but what it does do is it makes her sterile. But she'll also need hormone supplements to simulate puberty and bring her body through to further development because of that genetic flaw. But there are also people, similarly then, who suffer genetic flaws that produce the intersexed condition, where the genitals are not properly formed, or where there may be two sets of genitals. And as a consequence, this can create, as you can imagine, real problems for parents, knowing how to properly identify and raise their child. And thankfully, while there are more sophisticated tests that can help us know a better way forward, for people born with these conditions, you can imagine the struggle they're going to suffer through no fault of their own.
And that's where surgery probably would be.
Well, and this is not sex reassignment. Mm-hmm. This is gender clarification.
Right.
And yet, at the same time, as well as the fact that nature may give us disadvantage, how much more important is the role of nurture in affirming the value of that child, that instead of being crippled and defective because of this, they can be encouraged to know that while Mother Nature in her fallenness has produced this outcome, God has a plan. God will work it out, and medical science can help pave a way of clarity and to find a life that's more satisfying. It's a tough pill to have to swallow for a family to have a child born with this condition, but more research is being done in this field, and especially with our medical technology giving us that window into other features that help shape gender identity. Kids born with this disadvantaged need not be trapped by it. And I'm just thinking, too, as a parent myself, I would want my child does not suffer this, but some children do. In so many births, this problem will emerge. In spite of the fact that biology has taken your gender off track, what better partner in life than the Creator to help you get back on track? What better person to affirm gender when maybe family didn't know how, or maybe in school there was ridicule? There is a God of healing and affirmation who can bring that clarity back and help you find purpose and a way to go forward. When nature has disadvantaged you, God is bigger than fallen nature. So we hope that those watching will be encouraged that indeed Mother Nature may hand you a raw deal, but it's not the final word. It's not the last story. And I know people who've suffered from the hermaphrodite condition, and this one family beautifully nurtured this one child I'm thinking of, who reached adulthood. While embarrassed by this defect, they were not overwhelmed. They were able to get up and have a good sense of self and find life worth living, and that's because of our God.
Absolutely. I love how you put it, where no matter how we've been derailed, through God, through Christ, and His redemption, we can all be re-railed and back on track toward wholeness.
Maybe not easily, but sometimes making it is worth that struggle, and what better partner than God in our lives to help us achieve it.
So the transsexual has always felt they should have been the opposite sex. Do you think in some cases there could have been a spiritual element to that, where maybe there was occultic involvement or some spiritual oppression or even sins of the father passed down that could have pushed them towards that conclusion? And if so, how could they handle that? What can they do in that situation?
Well, that's quite a big question. I think at the end of the day, we can't rule out the idea that in addition to biological and psychological factors that contribute toward our problems, how can we deny the fact that not only are we fallen human beings in terms of being spiritually handicapped from the get-go as our foundation, there are, satanic influences that do affect the way that we think and perceive life events. and undoubtedly would magnify those life events to us. And so, you know, I can't give you empirical evidence that says, oh, this condition is the result of a demonic influence. But at the same time, Jesus did minister to demonic influences that did cripple and affect people's lives. And so we can't rule out that possibility. Sins of the fathers, too. Generational curses are more widely understood in church culture. And yet, while I can't, again, give you scientific evidence to verify that it's factual, demonic influences distort people's thinking, we can yet hear the testimonies and histories of people who might have participated in occult practices that opened them up to be influenced by the dark side, if you will. And you know, even spiritual forces and generational sins, I guess it's kind of like genetic traits passed down. Whether it's skin color and eye color, or the fact that my mother, who was immoral, was also creative. I was creative and became immoral. My mother was a substance abuser. I became a substance abuser. Her boundaries were violated. My boundaries were violated. You know, you can't prove it scientifically, but you can look back and observe certain traits that do get passed down in family lines. You can see patterns. And, you know, we both know Jan Frank as an author who deals with childhood sexual abuse. And in her own research as a survivor of sexual abuse, she says in her years of working with abuse survivors, she's noticed that in 75% of the cases when a daughter has been sexually violated, her mother was sexually violated in the generation before. Almost like something gets torn, or the umbrella gets ripped and it rains down on the next generation what made you wet in your generation. And so, again, you can't quite prove it, but you can recognize patterns. So we wouldn't want to deny that that could be the case. But while at the same time, say you do recognize there could be demonic influence, and in Christ we have authority to address it, I generally don't go digging. My assumption is that if a person submits themselves to Christ, then that issue, if present, will be inevitably addressed. And when surrendered to Christ, the influence of that will begin to be challenged, contained, and corralled until finally removed as a presence in that person's life.
So wait, I just want to hear you right as far as don't go digging because God will reveal it when it's time. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think, you know, in dealing with parasitic infections like that, there's no question, though they might be present, but how and when we address concerns like that also is very important. We need to be sensitive to when is the timing best for the most strategic optimum outcome in a person's life. And because these issues would be linked, you know, if there is demonic influence, it would be linked to personality and perception. We want to recognize and be sensitive to the spirit when would be the most appropriate time to address those concerns. And that's just not true on this issue. It would be really any issue. We expect that if a person's been exposed out there in a contaminated environment, they may have been infected, and those things are not greater than God's ability. What really matters is a life submitted to God, then He will address those concerns in due course, in my view. And so it's worth thinking about as it relates to this concern as well. So I know for me, when I began to grow in the Lord, there were those days when I really just began to pop out of what I would have called delusional thinking, and things just became clear for me. Now, whether there was some freedom or release from a demonic influence, I can't prove to you, but yet I distinctly remember those days when my thinking became very clear, and I marveled that I had even wanted to reject my gender. So worth thinking about, worth praying about, and not stressing about, but living submitted to God. He'll lead you and help you work it out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome. And I want to say one last thing, too. If you're watching and you want to know a little more clinical information and also values-oriented information, that means information that Christians would appreciate, then turn to the NARTH website. That's NARTH, the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, narth.com. When you go to that website, you're going to find not only information about the homosexual concern from a clinical perspective, but they are adding to that website further information about transsexualism, origins, and treatment outcomes. And this is not just a Christian group. It isn't a Christian group, in fact. The NARTH website is run by clinicians, psychiatrists, and doctors that put forth really good and bias-free data out there for you if you have further questions on the homosexual concern or transsexual issues. Again, there's not a lot of information out there. It's nice to know when those resources are available.
Thank you so much for being here and just for providing that education, that overview on something I had no idea what some of those terms even meant. And so I just really appreciate your insights and wisdom.
Very good. It's been my pleasure, Christine. Thanks.
We appreciate the opportunity to share with you these insights about transsexuality and gender identity. Thank you for tuning in to Pure Passion to hear God's redemptive point of view on these issues, because living in our culture, rest assured that you will be bombarded with information about sexuality, and often it's really nothing more than misinformation. That's why we at Pure Passion feel privileged to bring you the truth, God's truth, about His design for our sexuality. If you need more resources, please visit us at www.purepassion.us. I'm Christine Sneeringer, and for all of us here at Pure Passion, we look forward to the next time when we can be together and shed some light on how you can make Jesus the Lord over your sexuality.